Welcome back to the Fertile Dark. I'm your host, Daniel, and I'm excited to be back with you for another episode this week. Apologize for the hiatus. I have been wrapping up another round of courses for my master's program, which took all of my time and energy. But I'm excited to be back with you again this week, especially for what we're going to be talking about, which is the myth of Sisyphus. And before we jump into it, a big shout out and thank you to Ellie and Olivia who came and expressed interest in exploring this myth. Their interest and excitement for it really had me start thinking more deeply about it. Like, what is it about this story that continues to resonate across time? And what is it about this image of a man endlessly pushing a boulder up a hill that speaks to us even now? I really like the way that Stephen Fry puts it in his book Mythos at the end of his chapter on Sisyphus. He says, painters, poets, and philosophers have seen many things in the myth of Sisyphus. They have seen an image of the absurdity of human life, the futility of effort, the remorseless cruelty of fate, the unconquerable power of gravity. But they have seen, too, something of mankind's courage, resilience, fortitude, endurance, and self-belief. They see something heroic in our refusal to submit. And Sisyphus may be an ancient figure, but his struggle is deeply human. And that's the purpose of myth, is to be a storehouse of collective wisdom and knowledge that, although it may be lost in the present, can be accessed again from the past to help us deal with life's current concerns and challenges. And so today, as we push back the layers of the story, we'll hopefully do so in a way that helps us to relate to the tale of Sisyphus through a variety of lenses that help us to find some new meaning within the struggles we face and come away with a deeper connection to our own capacity for agency and meaning making and power as we face some of the absurdities that life throws at us. The story of Sisyphus is one that many of us know the end to, but maybe not all the details of. Sisyphus was a king of a country that was later known as Corinth. He exhibited a lot of different attributes, one of the paramount being cunning and ingenuity. He was able to solve problems that no one else was able to solve, and people came to him from all over for him to help them solve those problems. Sisyphus also is known for cheating death not once but twice, which is how he ended up in the predicament that all of us who are familiar with his tale know, which is the eternal struggle to push a boulder up a hill so that he can lay claim to immortality in the mortal world. And I'd like to look at his story through an existential frame. And there are three different people that I think can be helpful in the way we do that. The first is a French philosopher, Albert Camus, that lived around the time of World War II. Second is Irvin Yalom, who is an existential psychotherapist. The third is Viktor Frankl, all of whom provide a different angle that we can use to look at this tale. And then I'd really like to look at the reality of Sisyphus, which is, at least in my view, a tale of warning, because he was a terrible person. And hopefully we can also see some of his negative attributes from a perspective that helps us to be able to change maybe some of our self-sabotaging patterns that we engage in that land us in some of our own experiences of suffering. So let's dive into it. Starting with Albert Camus, he focused primarily on the absurdity of suffering. He wrote the book, The Myth of Sisyphus, and within that book, he says a few things that I think can be really helpful for us. He says, man stands face to face with the irrational. He feels within him his longing for happiness and for reason. The absurd is born of this confrontation between the human need and the unreasonable silence of the world. And then later he says, the struggle itself towards the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. And I really appreciate this perspective, that there is something about the struggles that we face in the day-to-day that to one degree or another is absurd and irrational. And yet we are face to face with them day in and day out. Camus gives us this way of looking at these struggles, whereby as we are willing to accept the absurdity of them, that we are able to then find reward in that acceptance, as we're willing to sit with the struggle and allow it to just be, rather than constantly fighting it and resisting it, that we then are able to come to a place beyond the struggle that allows us to put a smile on our face in spite of the hardship of it, which is where Camus comes from when he says that we must imagine Sisyphus in this place of pushing a boulder up a hill for all eternity, only to have it fall back to the bottom and reset. We must imagine that on his face is a smile, because he understands not just that this is an absurd task, but that he has come to a place of acceptance rather than resistance. And there are some things in our lives that are difficult in an absurd way, that the best thing that we can do is to stop fighting against it, to accept the absurdity of it, so that we can then move beyond defiance and struggle and find the smile on the other side. One of the areas of life that I'm really working on this is something that I was wrestling with today. I'm recording this at the end of February. And for whatever reason, at the end of February in Arizona, where I'm living right now, it has been in the 70s and 80s and even bumping up against 90 degrees in the heat of the day. I grew up in a place where at the end of February, it's freezing cold outside. There's snow and there's ice. Even where I went to university for my undergrad, it was so cold still at the end of February. And here we are, and it's in the 80s. And my wife and I take a road trip and we go to try and cool off a little bit. And it's in the 70s at the end of February, and it feels so hot. And so I'm sitting with this, knowing that the summer is going to just be miserable. And I get to ask myself the question of, do I fight against it internally? Do I defy this thing and try and wrestle with it day in and day out? Or do I take a step back? Do I allow the struggle to simply be without resistance, so that even though it's hard, I can have a smile on my face? And that's an opportunity that we can find from this story from the perspective of Albert Camus. And so just once again, that question, what would it mean to accept our most difficult struggles without resistance? And that could be a good opportunity to sit with, to write about. Another perspective here is Irvin Yalom. He focuses on existential crises that all of us are faced with. Specifically, there are 5 of them that he emphasizes: death, isolation, identity, freedom, and meaninglessness. And I love what he says about our approach to these crises. It is a matter of no small importance that one be able to explain and order the events in our lives into some coherent and predictable pattern. To name something, to locate its place in a causal sequence, is to begin to experience it as under our control. No longer then is our internal experience or behavior frightening, alien, or out of control. Instead, we behave or have a particular inner experience because of something we can name or identify. The because offers one mastery, or a sense of mastery that is tantamount to mastery. I believe that the sense of potency that flows from understanding occurs even in the matter of our basic existential situation. Each of us feels less futile, less helpless, and less alone, even when, ironically, what we come to understand is the fact that each of us is basically helpless and alone in the face of cosmic indifference. So I love this idea that as we are able to name a thing, as we're able to exert some responsibility for some ownership of our experience, that it then empowers us with a sense of mastery or something that we experience that is close to it. As we look at this idea through the mythic lens of the story of Sisyphus, we can start to see a couple things happening at the same time. One is that some of his experience is externally imposed. Sisyphus, especially his fate, which we tend to emphasize here, this fate of Sisyphus pushing this boulder up a hill, this is not something that he came up with. He did not create of his own intellectual prowess this challenge that he then offered up. Rather, after the second time he had cheated death, when it finally was his time to die, he is met by Hermes in the underworld, who offers Sisyphus two choices. One, which was completely distasteful to him, was paradise in Elysium for eternity. The other is an opportunity to win his immortality in the mortal world, to go back to the surface as the king for the rest of time, which of course Sisyphus is interested in. That is everything that he has been trying to do this whole time. The way that he is then given this chance is a struggle that is put upon him. His greatest desire is turned into an impossible struggle, which is this challenge of being required to push a boulder up a hill for eternity until he can reach the top with it, which he will never actually be able to do. This isn't something he wanted. This isn't something he contrived. It was something that was imposed on him. But at the same time, although this struggle was imposed, he did have some part in creating it. Part of it is that he made the choice to be there. He could have chosen Elysium, but he chose the rock. Part of it also is that Sisyphus was a terrible human being and made a lot of people really mad, including the Olympians. And that was initially through his spitting in the face of the sacred law of hospitality. He had guests come to him seeking his wisdom, seeking his creativity, his craftiness, and he just didn't treat them the way that he was required to. He also extorted them, exorbitantly high prices, and his payment for him solving their unsolvable problems. One of those problems, he directly interfered with one of Zeus's trysts to the mortal realm, which Zeus never took kindly to. He also operated in direct defiance of death by tricking Thanatos into binding himself and then hiding him and causing death to no longer exist temporarily until Ares complained about it to Zeus. Sisyphus later manipulated his wife into a scheme to cheat death a second time so that as he went to the underworld, he was in such a state that he could then manipulate Persephone into sending him back to the surface as a way to punish his wife, which he never intended to do. So his entire life, Sisyphus is making these self-interest-oriented choices that are making enemies everywhere, especially among the Olympians. Then, as a result, he is now presented with this choice, which he didn't come up with, but which he directly contributed to. And so for us, when we look at this, like we have this existential need to explain events, to take ownership of them, to say, this is my story, as a way to then work with it and gain mastery of it, where it is no longer something happening to me that is purely externally driven. It's no more imposed upon me, but it is something that I now am actively taking ownership of. Some of that is to just simply say, this is the story of me. Some of that is to say, how am I contributing to the story? So with Sisyphus, that's what we see. We see someone who is purely motivated by self-interest, who is directly contributing to the struggle he's now faced with for eternity. And we can take that as an evaluative opportunity to ask ourselves, how much of our current struggle is shaped by our own choices? And also, how might we reclaim agency within those circumstances? This can be a really hard one, but it is really helpful to consider. For example, over the last year, I have been faced with health challenges that I never anticipated or have experienced previously. At one point, it was severe enough that I genuinely wasn't sure that I would live through it. And this challenge persisted for months, and to a certain degree continues to persist. For a fair amount of this time frame, especially at the beginning, this was something that I viewed as purely external. This is a thing that has been imposed upon me. I went to different doctors and did so many tests and tried so many medications and continually was told there's nothing wrong with you, which obviously there was something wrong, but this there's nothing wrong with you was doctor code for we don't know what's wrong with you. I don't remember exactly what point this happened, but at some point I was faced with an opportunity to continue to see the struggle as something that was happening to me that I had no part of. I was purely the victim of circumstance. And when I took the time to really look at it and ask myself, what part of this is mine? How am I actually contributing to the creation of this struggle? I realized that there were several things that actually were occurring that I did have control over. One of the major areas of agency that I found was that I was not invested in self-care. I was burning the candle at both ends all the time. I was overworking myself significantly. I was not holding good boundaries around my time and my energy and requirements. I was overcommitting myself to all kinds of different things, many of which were not even authentic. They weren't aligned with my interests. They weren't aligned with my sense of purpose in the world. I was saying yes simply because I was afraid to say no. It was like this people-pleasing pattern of behavior that was then overextending what I had, my own internal resources. And now my body is constantly in depletion, wrestling to try and keep up. And then as a result, I get really sick. And as I came to this realization of, wow, some of this sickness that has persisted for months is actually my body telling me I have to slow down, I have to say no, and I have to learn to sit still. And once I realized that, all of a sudden, I started becoming more attuned to the signals my body was sending me. And I started being able to understand, when do I say no? When do I say yes? When do I need to advocate for rest? And then I began to notice other things that my body was telling me also, which was there's something else wrong with my body that I'm unsure of. One of those things was that I had broken my back and didn't know it. Another thing was that in the part of my spine that was directly associated with my heart and lungs, my spine was severely out of alignment, and that my spine was actually in a very severe state of disrepair that was preventing me from being able to recover energy in the way that I needed to. I started looking at my eating patterns and my water consumption and my exercise routine and my work habits, on and on and on. And I realized that this illness that I had been faced with, while yes, I did not choose it, I did have a capacity for agency and mastery within it to begin to make changes, which then has led to a significant increase in quality of life over the last few months. So again, when we look at our struggles, we ask ourselves, how much of our current struggle is shaped by our own choices, and how might we reclaim agency within that struggle? Another frame that we can use to look at this myth is Viktor Frankl, who wrote the famous book, Man's Search for Meaning. Viktor Frankl's view of the world is that all of us are motivated by a fundamental need to find meaning within our circumstances. And he says that even suffering can become meaningful when we choose how to respond. I love this quote from his book, Man's Search for Meaning. Well, two quotes really that I really love that I feel like represent this perspective. Everything can be taken from a man, but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. Also, when we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. There's actually just one more. I really love So much of Viktor Frankl here in this book. But he says, those who have a why to live can bear with almost any how. It's so powerful. Like the impact of finding meaning enables us to be able to work through so much struggle. And we see that in Sisyphus, right? He continues to push this boulder over and over and over again. He knows why he's there. He is so driven. He's so motivated that he continues to get so close to his goal and never succeed. And yet he is undaunted. He is undeterred. He can continue to bear the suffering of this punishment because he knows why he's doing it. As a result, this punishment that he's in has deep meaning to him. And we can really take this and we can look at the struggles that we have and we can really ask ourselves, can we find meaning even in situations that feel like punishment? It's not always easy, but we can find it. And sometimes we've got to do a lot of work around that. And there are some times that there's so much absurdity in the struggle that any meaning making is secondary. But if we can find it, if we can do what Viktor Frankl says and claim the why, then the how is able to be worked through in almost any circumstance. Now, I feel like we've done some exploration of a lot of positivity here with Sisyphus, but I do think it's important to consider two other things. One is the tension between fate and free will that we see in the tale of Sisyphus. We can often look at him as a victim of circumstance. We can also see ways that he's responsible for his fate. Would he have come to the same fate if he had been a good person, if he had been altruistic and giving and charitable and focused on serving those around him from a place of kindness and generosity? Would the gods have outlined the same consequences for him? Or was this simply a result of Sisyphus being a terrible person? That's the tension that we see here within the story, fate versus free will. And sometimes as we look at our struggles, we have that tension appear. And so we often find this question arising, and we might consider, how is it that we differentiate between what is out of our control and what is self-created? Looking at Sisyphus gives us some really good insight into the self-created piece. Yes, we see so much of the existential opportunity for meaning making and acceptance. And we also see that Sisyphus is someone who consistently displayed grandiosity, entitlement. He manipulated others. He couldn't see beyond his own self-interest. Everything he did was because he wanted the world to revolve around his interests. And he was willing to manipulate and sacrifice anyone and anything to get it. He was unable to see beyond that self-interest. And there are definitely times that this mirrors our own struggle with power and control. All of us have some degree of wounding that leads us to need to exert some control over the world, or to seek some kind of power. We've been made to feel small and powerless in some way, and we need to find that place of power within ourselves. The challenge comes in, for Sisyphus at least, is this unchecked hubris, this unchecked pride that leads him to being trapped in a cycle of suffering of his own design. For each of us, there are probably areas where we are similarly trapped within a cycle of effort that is ineffectual. That because of whatever internal wounding we have, we are doing our best to push forward through these lines of effort against an immovable object. Like our mechanism of effort is not achieving the desired end result. And the reason for that is because we are doing it from a place that lacks the appropriate perspective. Sisyphus lacked perspective. All he saw was his self-interest. Everybody else was expendable to him. And we may not feel that way about the world, but what we may be doing is in a similar vein of lacking perspective, approaching problems from a place that is unhelpful and unhealthy. And I love the way that Marcus Aurelius and Stoic philosophers talk about these obstacles that we keep forcing our way against. The obstacle that's in the way becomes the way. We can look at these areas in our lives where we are trapped in a cycle of ineffectual effort, and we can take a step back and evaluate and assess and say, what is this situation trying to teach me that I need to change? What are the ways that my efforting is not leading me to the desired result? So for Sisyphus, he continues to work the same line of effort. I start at the bottom, I push in a straight line up to the top. I don't make it to the top, the boulder rolls down to the bottom. What if instead we take a step back and even take a step to the side and say, what is the boulder teaching me about myself? What is the message here? And then change the approach. Allow the boulder to become the teacher and to show us what it is in ourselves that needs to be looked at and worked with. And often what we'll find is that the part of ourselves that is motivating this particular line of effort and struggle is a place within ourselves that is an opportunity for greater insight and compassion and love for ourselves. And so we might start to look at that and just ask ourselves about the areas in our life where these lines of effort are ineffectual and that a change needs to happen. What are those? Where are those? And what is this obstacle of ineffectual effort trying to teach me about myself and how I can see myself with greater compassion, greater love, and also work towards greater wholeness? And this effort, as well as some of these existential questions, I think there are different ways we can approach these. One might be through visualization, like meditation or mindfulness or some other visualization technique where we sit with and visualize the struggles that we are currently engaged in and the efforts we are exerting in and around those struggles. We can visualize within that space the nature of the burden. Is it external? Is it self-created? What are the opportunities to exert or exercise agency and responsibility? What are the parts of ourselves that are expressing a need to be seen and heard and understood that are contributing to ineffectual effort that is really just wearing us down without accomplishing anything? But use this as a visualization and then draw it out or write about it in some way. You can also skip the visualization and go straight to a journal activity. And we can ask ourselves within the journal, what boulders in our life might be self-inflicted? What are the boulders that I need to accept and stop fighting against? What meaning can be found for myself within the struggles that I face? How are my own tendencies, my own efforts driven from that place of internal wounding, or my own efforts driven for a need for power or control, shaping my experience of suffering? And how can I'm going to shift my perspective to find some meaning, as well as to find those spaces within that need more compassion, that need more love, and that are an opportunity for integration and wholeness in my life. Ultimately, Sisyphus can be many things to many people. For me personally, I see him both as a warning to avoid being purely driven by self-interest and to be wary of the way that I treat others so that I'm honoring them and collaborating with them rather than looking at others simply as a means to an end that are just chips on the board to be sacrificed and manipulated for my own self-interest. I also see his punishment as an invitation to consider my own need for meaning making, agency, and no longer fighting against or resisting something that needs to simply be. Whatever it is that you resonate in this myth, I hope that you can find meaning within the exploration that we've done. Especially, I hope that you can find a new degree of power and capacity for agency in the way that you interact with the struggles that you face. Thanks again for joining me here on The Fertile Dark. If you've found some meaning in our conversation today, I'd invite you to share this with someone that you feel like could benefit from it. I'd also encourage you to connect with us on social media through Instagram or Facebook. You can email us. And I'd also invite you to follow us on your favorite podcasting platform and leave us a review so that we can know what it is you're connecting with, what it is that you would want more from us, and overall just your experience with the episodes that we're creating. And as always, keep delving deep and embracing the journey.